power to influence. If we go back and remember the 12 Angry Men movie, juror number 8 initially voted and consistently voted not guilty. Well, what does your text say about that? For one, the minority has the ability to influence. The minority person, or in this case, the minority juror, had the ability to influence. However, that influence was tested quite often. If you remember that initially, juror number 8 voted not guilty. You will also remember that as the votes unfolded in the initial voting, that some of the members were intrigued by juror number 8 willingness to vote not guilty. So, as your text states on page 216, when someone in the group breaks the group's unanimity, members take notice of this. Now, they may not necessarily believe you to be right. They may not even really agree with you. But what it does is they take notice. Now, just disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing is not going to work in the minority's favor. So we'll go a little bit further. Your text mentions a researcher by the name of Moscovici. He says that, and if you look on page 216, figure 4.7, he gives a description or a model of this, what's called conversion theory of minority and majority influence. Now, what he says is that they go through what's called a validation process. Also, that when members hear the minority's message, they consider it. And the majority's message, in contrast, is a lot less intriguing. And when people discover where most of the group stands on a position through what's called a comparison process. In other words, they listen, they check, okay, and they're comparing who stands where. They check to see if they can join the majority. Because, see, being in the majority, in most cases, is more rewarding than membership in the minority. Those in the majority usually find that they can control the group's resources, whereas those in the minority have little say in regards to the group's decisions, and people usually come over and join the side of the majority. So, a real quick takeaway is that, one, groups go through, well, the minority's position on something is considered to be intriguing. Likewise, they go through what's called a validation process. And part of this validation process is called a comparison process. Group members are intrigued by the minority person's unique, independent thought, their willingness to step out and state such a thought, and they may even have some regard for that. And if you remember, in the initial, what's called straw poll, the voting that took place, the straw poll, the juror who stuck out and said not guilty, there was the older gentleman sitting next to him, juror number 9, who had a great deal of respect for this man that was what? Willing to stand alone. So, there you have it. So now, let's move on and look at what we call predicting minority influence. Predicting minority influence. Well, Moscovi's conversion theory began as a minority opinion that many of his researchers rejected, but it eventually won over even the most stubborn of the opposition, confirming the theory's own predictions. The question changed over time from are minorities influential to when are minorities influential? So if you go back and read, you'll see that there was a line of thought that they didn't believe, that many researchers rejected Moscovi's theory. But over time they realized that his theory had some import. And he actually was probably doing an application of his theory in this process. Now, what are some things that help us to predict minority influence? One, consistency and influence. Consistency. A consistency, according to Moscovici, I'm sorry, I mispronounced it earlier, Moscovici, verified the importance in maintaining consistency. In other words, if you go back to the juror number 8, he was consistent. He wasn't flip-flopping. He wasn't wavering. He wasn't being belligerent. He was open to being convinced otherwise. But the point is, he was consistent through and through with his arguments. Let's look at another term here called idiosyncrasy credits. Idiosyncrasy credits. Now, let's look and read a little bit of what the text says here on page 217. In 12 Angry Men, juror number 8 was influential, but so was juror 11. That juror voted guilty on the first ballot, as did the 10 other jurors. But when juror number 8 noted several conflicting aspects of the evidence, juror 11 changed his mind and shifted his vote. Did prefacing his dissent with conformity increase or decrease his influence? Well, that can be explained by understanding what's called idiosyncrasy credits. Edwin Hollander, 1971, developed the concept of idiosyncrasy credits to explain the group's positive reaction to a minority who preferences dissent with conformity. According to Hollander, idiosyncrasy credits accumulate as the member contributes to the progress of the group toward the desired goals. So, let's go back to juror number 8. Juror number 8 was dissenting. Juror number 8 was at some point early on there, to paraphrase, a thorn in the sides of some of the other jurors. You had one gentleman who wanted to get to a baseball game. You had another gentleman who said his business was going to craps, if you will. Those are my words, because of the time taken up. But you also had most of the jurors who were like, you know what, you are being a bit of a pain, but you are trying to push us toward the goal. And see, that's what Hollander is trying to bring out there. But let's look further. According to Hollander, again, idiosyncrasy credits accumulate as the member contributes to the progress of the group toward the desired goals. Because high status members have usually contributed more in the past and possess more valued personal characteristics, they have more idiosyncrasy credits. If they do not conform, therefore, when they do not conform, their actions are more tolerable than other members. Now, low status members' balance of credits is in comparison low, so they are permitted a smaller latitude of nonconformity. You remember earlier in the semester we talked about what's called a pecking order. There's a pecking order. In all groups there is a pecking order. We talked about that from previous chapters. Same thing happens in jurors. There's a pecking order. There are high status members and low status members. Maybe what are some elements of high status members? Your social economic status, your gender, your race. Yes, race does play a part in status credits in juror settings. So, what else does Hollander say? Hollander's advice about early conformity contrasts to some extent with Moscovici's recommendations concerning consent nonconformity. Hollander warned that dissenters who challenge the majority without first earning high status in the group will probably be overruled by the majority. But Moscovici argued that consistent nonconformity will lead to innovation and change. I tend to take from a bit of both, that there must be some consistency. But I also take Hollander's point that you have to kind of earn your dues in the group. In other words, Hollander said that dissenters who challenge without earning high status, in other words, earning the status in the group. And each group is different in a way. So how you earn the status in that group would vary perhaps from group to group. But the point, I think, the concept is consistent. You've got to earn the group's, if you will, admiration, if you will, or earn some credits in the group. And you must be consistent at the same time as you are working toward the overall or the desired goal of the group. Some other terms here that you need to be aware of was the concept of the diligence of dissenters. What does it say about that? Part of the secret of the unique influence of minorities lies in the quality of their argumentation. How do you put forth your argument? And so those that are members of the majority feel less pressured, if you will, to articulate their points clearly. Sometimes they are very flippant and nonchalant in their arguments of points. And sometimes when you listen, you're like, your points have very little weight whatsoever, very real little credibility. The minority, on the other hand, must take some pains in making a skillful argument with majority people. Okay. So we will stop right there and then come back and look at a couple of more elements of this chapter.